Dear friends, welcome to ePathshala. I am Dr. Vishal Jadhav, Department of Sociology, Tilak Maharashtra Vidya-mitra, Pune. Today we are going to look at a module titled Discipline, Surveillance and Governability, which is part of the paper Political Sociology. This module is a further continuance of the earlier module on knowledge and power access. In this module, we will learn how Foucault discusses how power influences and controls subjectivities, and it also objectifies bodies. We will see in this particular module how knowledge and how surveillance ensures that our bodies become docile and we conform to the normative order of society. Foucault's Discipline and Punish. Discipline and Punish, authored by Michel Foucault in 1975, is a seminal work that traces the historical genealogy of carceral institutions and punishment practices from the mid-18th century to the mid-19th century, particularly pertaining to the penal system in France. However, the focus was not only on prisons but also on the disciplinary institutions like schools, asylums, hospitals, barracks and factories that gradually began to employ similar means of governing behavior. Foucault contests the notion that there has been singular continuous trajectory by highlighting the ruptures in the display of power of the sovereigns and in the system of surveillance, constraint, control, examination and education of prisoners. Foucault also examines the development of prisons, modern disciplinary institutions, from scaffolds to penalties, describing the horrendous punishment in 1957 inflicted upon the mutilated body of a prisoner named Robert Damiens. Foucault reflects upon the public spectacle that was made of physical punishment evident in the scaffold. Robert Damiens, a soldier, had tried to assault King Louis XV and hence was condemned to death. Foucault shares the grotesque, graphic details of the brutal dismemberment of Damiens' public. Till the middle of 18th century, punishment of criminals in Europe was a cruel affair. However, late 18th century onwards, there were calls for reforms for a more civil and humane mode of punishment. It signaled the end of the public executions and torture rituals, especially scaffolds and ritual chain gang around the body of criminals. The bodies of criminals were no longer to be dismembered by the state. Rather, the state began to concentrate upon disciplining the soul of criminals. Penalties serve to be far more powerful restraint on people. In an environment where the crimes were perpetrated against people's good and properties, violent punishments were to be replaced by more humanitarian ones. Henceforth, a calculated economy of the art of punishment thus emerged, striving to achieve more efficient and effective punishment practices. According to Massimo Serrigiacomo, Foucault highlights the transition between the power of the sovereign to avenge towards the defense of society. The emphasis was now upon the prevention of crime and establishing order rather than on severe torture. Foucault outlines the rules undergirding the new penal system: graduated scale of punishment according to crime committed, less arbitrariness of punishments, punishment to discourage potential criminals, punishments to have a more concentrated impact on society rather than on criminals, crime verification process to be more transparent, classification of illegalities into such categories so that there is less scope for impunities. The decisions regarding the nature and duration of punishment was to be handed over to a coterie of experts such as psychiatrists, social workers and parole boards instead of judges who dispense penalties according to the law. Punishment is meant to instill within societies the idea of pursuing only legit activities and to deter people from illicit activities. It thus has a representative function to convey a legible lesson of morality. Multiple disciplinary institutions. Foucault examines how the techniques of discipline in schools, army barracks, hospital, mental asylums, monasteries and factories, wherein the body's operations are subjected to docility, utility relationship, eventually becomes generalized as formulas of domination during the 17th and 18th centuries. He identified the discipline in these institutions to be related to the architectural design, which he calls the art of distribution. Firstly, these are all enclosures protected spaces. Secondly, they all inher partitioning such that each individual has his own place and each place has its own individual. Secondly, they are structured in such a way that while communication among the individuals is discouraged, surveillance and control is facilitated. Thirdly, they all have elaborated hierarchies wherein they have elements like organizing cells, ranks or places. Thus, the objective of modern architectural design, that is to render visible those under observation, was a shift from the earlier one, that is to display the privileged status of those in power. In addition, Foucault highlights how activities in these institutions are controlled. Firstly, they all follow a timetable which divides time into slots and creates daily rhythms and cycles, as well as an occupational routine to be followed by individuals. Secondly, the activities are broken down into sub-elements which follow a specific sequence of progression and definite period. For instance, in the army, teaching to shoot itself is decomposed into many tiny steps, like how to hold a gun, how to look down the barrel, how to position it on the shoulder, and how to pull the trigger. By doing so, it puts into effect micromanagement, which creates docile bodies that not only carry out the activity of the supervisor wants them to, but also in the way it is desired. Thirdly, by aligning the overall body with certain gestures, it is schooled into being efficient and fast. Fourthly, they lay out the relations that bodies should have with the manipulated object. Fifthly, the specific internal arrangement, maximum efficiency, and hasten the use of time, which are intrinsic to discipline, are essential for achieving positive economies. By better aligning time, bodies and forces, bodies are made amenable to capital. Foucault states that like a machine, discipline intends to create productive force with maximum efficiency. At the same time, he also states that the individuality created out of the bodies controlled by discipline has four characteristics. It is cellular due to spatial distribution, it is genetic accumulation of time, it is organic coding of activities, and it is combinatory composition of forces. Discipline intends to train the individual, and this is made possible through hierarchical observation, examination, and normalizing judgment. Hierarchical observation. The individual under observation are made aware that they are under continuous surveillance. In fact, the entire area is brought under a sweeping disciplinary gaze. Normalizing judgments. Since the new art of discipline is meant to be corrective, it tends to dispense both punishments as well as gratifications while training individuals. Individuals are subjected to scrutiny whether or not they adhere to a standard benchmark of behavior. This hierarchy of value is derived from the quantification and qualification of behavior, which enables a series of comparisons. The intrinsic right or wrong nature of the act does not matter, only whether they can be placed on a ranked scale of behavior. There is no respite from being judged, since there is this constant goading to move on to the next level of achievement. Gary Gutting adds that since in the very modern age, individuals are afraid of being judged abnormal, they are restrained at every moment in their lives. Gutting states that normalization is evident, for instance, in national standards for educational programs, for industrial processes, etc. Examination. It combines the above two techniques. Examination is extremely ritualized, wherein the individual is being examined, are made visible, and are enmeshed in a web of written documentation and records. Also, every individual is reduced to a single case, which can be measured and weighed against others. Categories, norms, and averages can be churned out on the basis of the accumulated information. Documentation is thus intended to dominate and control. It is a prime locus of modern power, knowledge, since it combines into a unified whole, the deployment of force and establishment of truth. Gutting states that it reveals the truth about those who undergo the examination, tells us why they know or what is the state of their health, and controls their behavior by forcing them to study or directing them to a course of treatment. For instance, absentee records in schools enable them to control students. Panopticism. Lastly, Foucault elucidates Panopticism. Panopticism originated during the control of the plague in 17th century. Spatial divisions were imposed to separate the infected from others, while all stray animals were killed. Houses were subjected to constant scrutiny and permanent written registration. Every house was locked, and a syndic, government official, would retain the key with him, and no one was allowed to leave the town. If any individual tried to move, he would either die of the contagion or face the wrath of punishing authorities. The army surrounded the town. There were soldiers posted at every nook and corner. Observation towers were erected at the town gates. The syndic visits each and every house and does a roll call of its residents, who have to show their faces at the windows. In case the latter do not respond, they will be suspected of harboring the sick or the dead. Subsequently, the syndic would report to the intendants, holders of public administrative office, and magistrate would control the medical treatment as well. The surveillance of the pathological bodies was thus centralized. Foucault refers to philosopher Jeremy Bentham's design for a prison, Panopticon of 1843, wherein delinquent individuals are under surveillance. The Panopticon is a tower present in some prisons, schools, hospitals, and factories, which is used to keep a check on every individual. It is situated in a ring-like formation. The center tower has large windows facing the buildings surrounding it. The building encircling the tower has double sets of windows, one turned inward and the other positioned to the outer side, enabling sunlight to illuminate the cell. Each cell in the building imprisons the delinquent, a lunatic, a criminal, a worker, etc. And the sunlight flooding the cell reveals the imprisoned occupant to the gaze of the supervisor sitting in the tower. There is no protection from the latter's gaze. An instance of the Panopticon has been given below. Foucault creates a foreboding picture when he describes the effects of Panopticon. The individual is isolated, atomized, and made conscious of being constantly watched, although he cannot pinpoint the exact moment when he is being watched. He states that the individual is the object of information, but he is hardly the subject in communication. Panopticon thus embodies the functioning of power. It is an efficient machine, since while it enhanced the number of individuals under observation, it also drastically cut down on the number of supervisors required. Mills states that even if the supervisor is absent, the disciplinary gaze has been internalized by the individual under surveillance, and that he conforms to the laid out behavioral norms. These disciplinary techniques gradually were legitimated, cast in a positive light, particularly in its propensity to train individuals. Although Bentham's Panopticon model never saw the light of the day, it did become generalized and permeated throughout other organizations. The state especially relied upon the police apparatus, which would render each individual visible while simultaneously remaining invisible. Mill cites another example by referring to the use of closed-circuit television cameras in the streets of Britain, whose presence and the notion that the police were watching discouraged crime. Closer home, activist groups like the Center for Excellence for Protection of Human Rights in Cyberspace have expressed concern about the protection of human rights in cyberspace, have expressed concerns about the implementation of the Aadhaar project. The project, which issues unique identity numbers to citizens, claims to facilitate financial inclusion and targeted subsidy payments. The organization, however, alleged that the project was the digital panopticon of India and condemned it as a ruse for surveillance. Rise of prison. Foucault also elucidates the remolding of the institution of the prison in line with the new penal system, which brought together deprivation of freedom with the technical transformation of individuals. Prison inheres alienation, routine and control, conduct, and the modulation of penalty. As the prison registers, records, and accumulates a mass of data about the criminal bodies, it is oriented towards not only enhancing efficiency and productivity, but also normalize the latter. As an instance, he cites from the document dated to 1837, which states that delinquents in Paris have to undergo a regimented schedule. When they have to arise at 6 in the morning during winter and 5 in summer, they have to go to sleep strictly at 9 o'clock during winter and 8 o'clock in summers. They have to put in around 9 hours of work, and 2 hours every day they have to sit for instructions. Victor Tadros states that discipline thus homogenizes individuals through the activities conducted in the institutions. Foucault traces the complete institutionalization of the penal system to the launching of the Mettray prison on 22nd February 1840. The prison wardens were portrayed as technicians of behavior and engineers of conduct who could foster governable bodies. Foucault points to a coterie of factors: psychiatry, judicial apparatus, and power of normalization, which facilitated the emergence of a body of knowledge laced with power targeted towards delinquents. This power knowledge, in turn, was responsible for the metamorphosis of the erstwhile category system into the penal, the erstwhile castigatory system into the penal system. The new development was not to retaliate against the crime, but to reform and rehabilitate the criminal. It was concerned about the environment, heredity, and parents, actions that were perceived to be responsible for the criminal behavior. Despite all these efforts geared towards efficiency, productivity, and deterrent of illicit activity, the penal system has failed to do so, hence continues to exist. Foucault recounts the failures: unable to diminish crime rate, unable to prevent lapses into criminal behavior, unable to stop emergence of delinquents. On the contrary, the punishing of the criminals' families towards the poverty trap only ends up increasing the number of delinquents. Prisons also tend to urge and forge future criminal deals by organizing the criminals. Even when the convicts leave the prison, the societal conditions are such that they are forced to resort to the previous illicit activities. However, it should be noted that the penitentiaries were not meant to eliminate the offenses, but were meant to distinguish and distribute them. Foucault also criticizes the court's penchant for handing definite sentences to criminals, which disposes of their cases once and for all. He claims that the guilty charge against a criminal cannot be prolonged for a very long time, and no individual is inherently dangerous. Foucault argues that the present judicial system tends to penalize very few crimes, such as industrial accidents, which are randomly determined. Moreover, few crimes that are committed are prosecuted like tax evasion, while ignoring the rest. He suggests that rather than simply fining and imposing and imprisoning delinquents, there can be other alternatives such as public service. By imposing a set of obligations, it can ensure that there are constraints on the delinquent's behavior. Gutting states that Foucault's criticism of disciplinary penal system was also meant to contest the idea that the new system was a progressive, enlightened development. The idea of the new penal system was not to diminish punishment, but to improve it. Foucault clarifies later in an interview with Aspire that rather than simply outlining the history of the penal and carceral system or simply criticizing its problematic aspects, he wanted to attack the system of thought undergirding it. He wanted to challenge the supposed rationality of the idea that the prison is the most efficient institution to deal with crime. He dismisses the claim of the earlier reformers and the modern system of penalties that they were advocating was more humane, different from the earlier one. Rather, he argued, they had uncritically accepted the logic behind the earlier system and were only trying to figure out which institutions would best serve its purpose and help attain its end. Concept of power and the marginal. One may ask, how does discussing the details of modern penal system help us? Foucault's work on the penal system helps reveal the way power operates in society. Parallel to the change in the system of punishment, there is a transition in the way power circulates. Earlier, the king represented the nation and dispensed power from above, exhibited through public torture rituals. Now, power permeated the whole society. Sarah Mills states that Foucault's work is focused on the functioning of power in the everyday relationship between the individual and social institutions, as well as on individuals' conformity with or resistance against power. For Foucault, power is not a possession assumed to be held by those dominant, while those dominated attempt to extract it from the former. Power is also not imposition of the will of the powerful on the subservient individuals. Rather, power is a strategy and is constantly performed. He says that individuals are the vehicles of power, not its points of application. Gutting too states that Foucault does not give credit to any particular class or world historical factors for the rise of modern power. Rather, he claims that modern power, in the manner of genealogy, was the chance result of multiple uncoordinated cases. Power permeates throughout society and is dispensed through a number of micro-centers. This sets Foucault's work apart from earlier Marxist theorists who held particular groups and institutions, the bourgeoisie, the central bank, the military high command, and the government press responsible for societal domination. They were convinced that by taking over these institutions and groups through a revolution, freedom is attainable. For instance, renowned Marxist Louis Althusser had conceived of power in one-dimensional manner as emanating from the top downwards. The state represses individuals who fall prey to his ideology. However, Foucault contests that there are numerous centers of power that do not succumb to revolution. He attacks the state apparatus of Soviet Union for changing leaders, and yet there is no destabilization of the hierarchies of society like family, sexuality, the body that exists in capitalist society. He says the state consists in the codification of a whole number of power relations which renders its functioning possible, and revolution is a different type of codification of the same relation. Since the revolutionaries strive for a top to bottom centralized control, the revolutions tend to be inclined towards totalitarianism. Rather than striving for global transformation, there should be a shift towards local politics. In addition, Marxist theorists evince faith in the permanence of the state, rendering them oblivious to the possible ruptures in power and hence the potential for change. Foucault calls the state a mythicized abstraction, which is rather limited. He puts forth the concept of marginal. The marginalized individuals and groups occupy an interesting position. While they are part of the same society as their non-marginalized counterparts, yet they are sidelined because of the values they hold, are not in line with the latter, or their welfare is not taken into consideration, unlike the latter. For instance, homosexuals, migrant workers, prostitutes, etc. Gutting adds that to incorporate the marginalized into the political program means a complete overthrow of a society's core values need not be carried out. Only some measures of reform is needed. Foucault cautions that the politics of marginalization may further marginalize, since it may institute a spokesperson for them, thus muffling the voices of the marginalized. Hence, his group, founded during the early 1970s, relied upon Foucault's public intellectual status only to publicize the testimonies of prisoners. As such, Foucault's conception of power acknowledges individuals not as passive dupes but as active agents. Criticism. Firstly, Foucault has been accused by Donnelly of not clarifying the processes through which disciplinary practices of the prison get diffused throughout society. Others were critical of his exposition of the role played by reformers for developing the prison during the 19th century. Foucault had argued that reformers, in their zeal for efficient control, ironically ended up giving rise to the very institution that they disapproved of. David Rothman and Michel Ignatieff, however, place the reformers at the heart of the modern prison system and argue that they had mandated religious pedagogy in jail, feeding and clothing the inmates, their sanitation, etc. Secondly, in Discipline and Punish, Foucault argued that there is no chance for resisting since power is inbuilt in us. This is contrary to Foucault's work in History of Sexuality, where he tried to transcend the conventional view of power as only constraining or suppressing of the powerless. Instead, repressive institutions could be productive and could engender novel kind of behavior. It is also unstable, has to be repeatedly sustained, hence amenable to resistance. As such, feminist theorist Sandra Bartke argued that Foucault appears to deny at times the challenges posed to control. Thirdly, Foucault has been criticized by historians like Peter Steinberg for misinterpreting the period and the reasons behind the ending of public executions. Steinberg dismisses the idea that the abolition was a singular event, arguing that it was a series of gradual steps towards privatizing punishment. He instead traces the end of public punitive system to as early 1600, when judicial use of mutilation had considerably diminished in Europe. Fourthly, D. Garland argues that with the exception of power and control, Foucault does not recognize the role played by any other value in the development of the penal system. The latter also appears to turn a blind eye to the ideological and political opposition to the new punishment system and the attempts to protect liberties. Garland also attacks him for exaggerating the extent of spread of disciplinary practices which remain bound by the legalistic juridical network. A completely disciplinary society is yet to be fully realized and remains at best an ideal type. Also, when it comes to local anti-authority struggles, Foucault, in an interview with Might Gain, had acknowledged that the subordinated may denigrate into violent and dictatorial power and had not rejected such forms of popular justice. He claimed that given proper information and discussion, the need for retaliation amongst the masses can be better developed. However, Sarah Mills criticizes that Foucault misjudged the situation, citing the example of backlash of mob justice against individuals accused of pedophilia who were attacked outside court in Britain in 2001. She argues that the championing the power of the proletarian groups, lynch mobs and murderers, individuals who have of their own volition disturbed society is problematic. In spite of all these criticisms leveled against his work, Foucault's work has elicited interest of feminists and other critical theorists. Therefore, to summarize this particular module, we have seen how Foucault talks about invisible ways, practices, knowledge forms, and of course, the panopticon of self-disciplining one's bodies and one's mind to conform to the normative order of society.